Imagine a common French peasant woman who, during the brutal years of the Nazi occupation, lived like a queen, while every single one of her neighbors was literally starving to death in the cold streets. Every single week, a black Mercedes pulled up to her modest home, and high-ranking SS officers in polished boots personally handed her heavy envelopes stuffed with untraceable cash in the dead of night. These were not bribes for information. These were child support payments, authorized directly by the Chancellery in Berlin. The child she was hiding from the world was a living, breathing Nazi artifact. He was the secret heir of the Third Reich. In 1973, the director of the CIA ordered the total destruction of every single document and file related to the existence of this mysterious boy. But they forgot about one wooden box in a dusty attic that proves the monster did not die alone in his bunker. The truth they tried to burn was far more disturbing than any history book dared to record. For decades, the world believed Adolf Hitler died in a Berlin bunker without leaving any heirs behind. But in 1977, a quiet Frenchman named Jean-Marie Loret stepped out from the shadows with a claim that would rewrite the history books forever. He didn't want money or fame. He wanted the truth about the man who visited his mother in a small French village during the First World War. This wasn't just a rumor. It was a secret whispered on a deathbed that changed his life into a nightmare. The real terror began when researchers looked at the evidence. The physical resemblance was bone-chilling. The blood types matched. Even hidden paintings found in a dusty attic suggested a connection no one was ever supposed to find in those dark years. By the end of this journey, you will see the classified documents and the DNA results that the authorities tried to ignore. You will understand why some believe the most hated man in history didn't just leave a legacy of ash, but a living son. The story begins in 1917 in the tiny commune of Fournes-en-Wep. A young French girl named Charlotte Lobjois met a soldier. He wasn't French. He was a German messenger who spent his free time painting the countryside under a gray sky. But this wasn't a normal romance. The soldier was quiet, intense, and prone to sudden outbursts of rage. He spoke no French, and she spoke no German. Yet for weeks they were inseparable, while the sounds of artillery thundered in the distance. Wait until you see what happened when he returned to that same region years later. He didn't come as a lonely soldier, but as the Führer. The records of his visit were kept under the highest level of secrecy for a reason that still haunts France. Charlotte never told her son the name of his father. Jean-Marie grew up feeling like an outsider in his own town. He was bullied by the other children. He was called a son of a German. Little did he know, his neighbors were closer to the truth than they imagined. It wasn't until 1948 that his mother finally broke her silence. Just before she died, she pulled him close and whispered a name that felt like a death sentence. The man he had been fighting against for years was his own father. Jean-Marie was a veteran of the French resistance. He had spent years risking his life to sabotage the very army his father led. The irony was suffocating. To accept his identity was to accept that his blood was stained by the greatest evil of the century. He tried to bury the secret for over 20 years. He worked hard, raised a family, and lived a normal life. But the reflection in the mirror wouldn't let him rest. Every time he looked at his own face, he saw the features of the man who burned Europe. Then, things took an even stranger turn. Jean-Marie discovered a collection of paintings in his mother's attic. They were signed by the German soldier from 1917. One of them looked exactly like his mother, painted by a hand he recognized. But that wasn't the only thing he found in those boxes. He discovered that during the German occupation, high-ranking officers had been delivering envelopes of cash to his mother. Why would the Third Reich send money to a random French peasant woman? The investigation into these payments led him down a rabbit hole of military intelligence. The trail led directly back to the Chancellery in Berlin. Someone was watching over them from the very top of the Nazi machine, while the rest of France starved. Jean-Marie hired a lawyer and a team of scientists in 1979. He needed proof. He needed to know if his mother's dying confession was the truth or a hallucination. What the forensic experts discovered sent shockwaves through the government. They compared the handwriting. They compared the ear structures. They compared the facial proportions using state-of-the-art equipment. The results were statistically impossible to ignore. But just as the world started to listen, the evidence began to vanish. The French Secret Service began to take a sudden interest in his case. His phones were tapped. His meetings were monitored by men in gray suits. It seemed that the ghost of the Führer was more dangerous in 1980 than he was in 1945. But the most disturbing piece of the puzzle wasn't found in a laboratory. It was found in the memoirs of a high-ranking Nazi official who mentioned a secret child in France. A child whose existence was the Reich's most protected secret of all time. The war was raging only a few miles away, but in the fields of Fournay-en-Wep, a young girl was about to change the course of secret history. Charlotte Lobjois was only 16 years old when she saw a German soldier standing near a haystack with a wooden easel. He wasn't like the other soldiers who drank and joked in the village taverns. This man was solitary, intense, and obsessed with capturing the desolate French landscape on his canvas. He looked out of place among the mud and the blood of the trenches that surrounded their small world. But this encounter was never supposed to be recorded in any official military journal. What started as a curious glance between a peasant girl and a foreign messenger turned into a secret bond that would later terrify the highest offices of the French government and the Nazi elite. They spent their days walking along the banks of the local rivers, but they could barely speak to each other. Charlotte later recalled that the soldier would often launch into long, angry speeches in German, shouting at an imaginary audience while she stood there in confused silence. It was a relationship built on shadows and silence. He was a man with no friends, a failed artist who had found a purpose in the violence of the Great War. Yet, for a brief moment in 1917, he seemed to find a strange kind of peace in the arms of a French girl. But the peace didn't last, and the soldier was soon called back to the front lines. He left Charlotte with nothing but a few paintings and a secret that was already growing inside her. He disappeared into the smoke of the war, leaving a small village to deal with his legacy. Then, things became much darker for the young mother. When Jean-Marie was born in March of 1918, the village did not offer congratulations. They saw the baby as a mark of shame, a child of the enemy, born from a woman who had consorted with the invaders. Charlotte was cast out by her own family. She was forced to flee to Paris, leaving her infant son with his grandparents. She wanted to erase the memory of the soldier, but the boy's face wouldn't let her. As he grew, his features began to mirror the man who was now rising to power. The physical evidence was becoming impossible to ignore as the years passed. By the age of 10, Jean-Marie had the same piercing eyes and the same structured jawline as the man whose voice was beginning to boom across the radio stations of Europe in the 1930s. But it wasn't just the looks that were haunting. Jean-Marie developed a sudden, unexplainable interest in art and military history. He had a temper that flared up without warning, a mirror image of the soldier his mother had described from those walks in 1917. The most shocking part was yet to come. In the late 1930s, as the shadow of the swastika fell over Europe, Charlotte began to receive mysterious visitors. They weren't locals. They were well-dressed men who spoke perfect French, but had an unmistakable German coldness. These men didn't come to threaten her. They came to pay her. Large sums of money began to arrive in plain envelopes. It was a lifeline for a woman who had nothing. But the price of this charity was her absolute silence about the father of her child in the countryside. Jean-Marie, now a young man, had no idea where the money was coming from. He was busy joining the French military, ready to defend his country against the very nation his father was currently leading into a global catastrophe. The stage was set for a tragic confrontation. But then the German army crossed the border in 1940. France fell in weeks. Suddenly, the village of Fournes-en-Wep was under Nazi occupation. And the first thing the German secret police did was head straight for the local birth registries of 1918. They weren't looking for criminals. They were looking for a specific name. They wanted to find the boy born to Charlotte Lovejoy. Every document related to his birth was seized and transported back to Berlin under the direct supervision of the Gestapo's highest ranks. Why would the most powerful men in the Third Reich care about a provincial birth certificate during a world war? The answer lies in a hidden bunker, where a map of France was marked with a single red circle around the town where Charlotte once walked with her soldier. But even the Gestapo couldn't find Jean-Marie. He had vanished into the shadows of the French resistance. He was now a ghost, hunting the soldiers of the man who had given him life. He was a son preparing to kill his father's dream, one sabotage mission at a time. Wait until you hear what Jean-Marie found when he finally confronted his mother years after the war ended. The truth wasn't just in her words. It was in a hidden compartment of an old wooden chest that contained items that should have been destroyed decades ago. By the year 1940, the Nazi war machine had crushed France under its iron heel. In every town, people were starving, and the shadow of the Gestapo loomed over every street corner. But for Charlotte Lovejoy, the occupation brought a terrifying and unexplained privilege. While her neighbors stood in long lines for a single loaf of bread, Charlotte seemed to lack for nothing. Eyewitnesses later whispered about black Mercedes cars pulling up to her modest home in the middle of the night. These were not the vehicles of common soldiers or local police. These cars belonged to the upper echelon of the German military administration. Men in polished boots and tailored gray uniforms were seen carrying heavy envelopes into her house. They stayed for hours, and when they left, Charlotte was always left with enough cash to live like royalty. But this wasn't an act of kindness from the invaders. It was a cold, calculated operation to keep a secret buried under a mountain of bills. The German High Command was funneling money to a French peasant woman for a reason that was labeled as the highest level of state security. Jean-Marie, now a young man of 22, was watching from a distance with growing suspicion and anger. He saw his mother consorting with the very men who were destroying his country. He didn't know the truth yet, but he knew that something about his life was a lie. The most disturbing evidence came from the German military archives found after the war. Records showed that the Gestapo had created a special file dedicated entirely to Charlotte Lovejoy. They tracked her every move, her health, and most importantly, the whereabouts of her son. Wait until you see the specific instructions found in the diary of a German officer. He noted that the woman and the boy were under the personal protection of the Chancellery in Berlin. Any soldier who bothered them would face immediate execution by the SS without a trial. But there was a problem that the Nazi spies couldn't solve. Jean-Marie Loret was not the puppet they expected him to be. Despite the secret protection and the blood in his veins, he had a fire in his soul that was purely French. He refused to accept the comfort of the occupiers. In 1941, Jean-Marie made a decision that would put him on a direct collision course with his own father. He joined the French resistance. He became a shadow in the night, blowing up supply lines and sabotaging the very army that was secretly paying for his dinner. The irony was absolute. While Hitler sat in his bunker planning the conquest of the world, his alleged son was in the French countryside, putting a knife to the throat of the Third Reich. It was a silent war between a father who didn't know his son was a traitor to the cause. The Gestapo became desperate. They knew they couldn't arrest Jean-Marie without exposing the secret they were sworn to protect. They were forced to watch from the sidelines as he carried out missions that should have landed him in a concentration camp or before a firing squad. Then, things took an even stranger turn in 1944. As the Allied forces began the liberation of France, the German officers visiting Charlotte suddenly vanished. But before they left, they made one final attempt to bring the boy into the fold of the dying Reich. A high-ranking SS officer approached Jean-Marie in secret. He didn't tell him who his father was, but he offered him a position of immense power in Germany. He told him that he was special, that his future was tied to the destiny of the new order. Jean-Marie's response was a punch to the face. He stayed with the resistance until the very end, fighting in the streets during the liberation of Paris. He was a hero to his comrades, but every time he looked at the captured German prisoners, he felt a strange, sickening pull in his gut. A connection he couldn't yet explain. But the real reveal happened in the quiet aftermath of the war. With the Nazis gone and the money dried up, Charlotte Lobjois began to crumble. She became a ghost of her former self, haunted by the memory of the messenger who had painted her portrait in 1917. She kept a small locket around her neck that she refused to let anyone touch. Jean-Marie once caught a glimpse of what was inside. It wasn't a photo of a local boy or a family member. It was a tiny, hand-painted miniature of a soldier with a very recognizable mustache. The secret was rotting Charlotte from the inside out. She knew that if the people of France found out who her lover really was, she would be dragged into the street and shorn of her hair as a collaborator. Or worse, she and her son would be executed as the ultimate enemies. But the most shocking piece of evidence didn't come from a locket or a diary. It came from a discovery Jean-Marie made in the attic of their old house. Hidden beneath floorboards was a set of oil paintings that looked exactly like the work of the man who led Germany to ruin. One painting was a self-portrait. Another was a landscape of the very field where they had met. But the third painting was the one that stopped Jean-Marie's heart. It was a portrait of a woman who looked exactly like a young Charlotte Lobjois, signed with a familiar, sharp script. Jean-Marie stared at the signature for hours. He compared it to the handwriting on the envelopes of cash his mother had received during the war. The match was undeniable. He was looking at the proof that his mother had been the lover of the most hated man on the planet. But as he dug deeper into the attic, he found something even more classified. A set of medical records from a German field hospital that mentioned a child born to a French civilian, but documented as a German national of the highest importance. The web was tightening. Wait until you see what Jean-Marie did next. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the press. He decided to confront the ghost of his father in the only way he knew how, by finding the others who might share his cursed bloodline and demanding the truth from the archives. In 1944, Jean-Marie Loret was a shadow in the night. He was a brave member of the French resistance, risking everything to drive the German occupiers out of his homeland. He didn't know then that he was fighting against his own father's legacy. He spent his nights sabotaging railway lines and cutting communication wires. Every explosion he caused was a blow to the man sitting in the Berlin chancellery, The irony was thicker than the smoke from the burning Nazi trucks he left in his wake during the war. He hated the men in the gray uniforms with a passion that felt personal. He saw them as monsters who had stolen the soul of France. Little did he know that the most powerful monster of them all was the one who had given him his very life in 1917. But there was something strange about his time in the underground. While other resistance members were being rounded up and executed by the Gestapo, Jean-Marie always seemed to have a guardian angel. He narrowly escaped traps that should have been his end. Was it luck? Or was there an order from the top to keep the French boy alive? Modern historians have found clues suggesting that the SS had strict orders never to harm him. He was a weapon of the resistance, protected by the very target he was aiming at. After the war ended in 1945, he tried to move on. He worked as a businessman and raised 7 children of his own. He wanted a quiet life away from the ghosts of the past. But the mirror in his hallway told a different story every morning. He looked at his reflection and saw the sharp nose and the intense, brooding eyes. He saw a man who looked like he belonged on a propaganda poster in Munich rather than a suburb of Paris. The suspicion was a slow poison that began to leak into his mind. Then came the moment that shattered his reality. In 1948, Charlotte Lovejoy lay on her deathbed. The room was cold, and the air was heavy with the scent of medicine and regret. She called Jean-Marie to her side for one last revelation. She didn't talk about the weather or his children. She spoke about a young German soldier from the First World War. She finally uttered the name that had been a taboo in their house for 30 years. "Your father," she whispered, "was Adolf Hitler." Jean-Marie felt the world tilt on its axis. The hero of the French resistance was the biological heir to the architect of the Holocaust. He didn't cry or scream. He sat in total silence as the weight of the 20th century crashed down upon him. For the next 20 years, he fell into a deep depression. He didn't tell a soul, not even his wife. He worked harder, hoping to bury the shame under layers of routine. But the secret was too heavy to carry alone, and it was starting to destroy him. But that was just the beginning of his obsession. He began to read every book about the Third Reich. He studied every photograph of the Führer, looking for his own ears, his own hands, and his own hairline. Every detail he found was a piece of a jagged puzzle. In 1975, he finally decided to break the silence. He contacted a lawyer and several world-renowned scientists. He didn't want money or fame. He wanted to know if he was a biological accident or the most well-kept secret of the Great War. The investigation led him to a small town in Germany to meet with Hitler's surviving relatives. The meeting was tense and cold. They looked at him as if they were seeing a ghost from a past they wanted to forget. The resemblance was enough to make them tremble. But meetings weren't enough to satisfy the world. He needed science. He needed the kind of proof that could stand up in a court of law. He began a journey into the world of forensic genealogy that would take him from the labs of Paris to the archives of the KGB. Just as he started to gain traction, the strange accidents began. Unmarked cars started following him to work. His house was broken into, but the intruders only looked through his private documents. It seemed someone was still protecting the secret in the 70s. Who wanted to keep the son of Hitler in the shadows? Was it the French government, terrified of the global scandal? Or was it a group of neo-Nazis looking for a new leader to rally around? Jean-Marie was no longer a soldier. He was a target once again. Wait until you hear what the scientists found in his blood in 1979. The results were so controversial that the head of the laboratory refused to sign the final report. There was an anomaly in his code that pointed directly to the Berlin bunker. The investigation moved from dusty attics to high-tech laboratories in 1979. Jean-Marie Loret hired a team of forensic experts to analyze his body like a crime scene. This wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about the cold, hard numbers of human genetics. Anthropologists at the University of Heidelberg took hundreds of measurements of his skull. They compared the distance between his eyes and the curve of his jaw to archival photos of the German leader. The experts were stunned by the mathematical precision of the facial overlap. But this was only the beginning of the shock. The researchers moved on to his blood, looking for a biological signature that could prove or disprove his mother's dying words. What they found in the vials of his type A blood sent a chill through the clinical team. In 1980, the results showed that Jean-Marie shared the same rare blood characteristics as the man he claimed was his father. While not definitive proof on its own, the statistical probability of such a match was becoming too high for the skeptics to dismiss. And then, the investigation took an even stranger turn toward the written word. Experts in graphology were given samples of Jean-Marie's handwriting alongside letters written by the young German corporal in 1917. The similarities were described as eerie. Scientists even analyzed his gait and physical mannerisms through old film. Jean-Marie walked with a specific stiffness in his right shoulder, a trait that was often noted by those who served with Hitler in the trenches. It was as if his body was reenacting the past. But there was one piece of evidence that the French government tried to keep out of the headlines. A secret file from the Paris police prefecture revealed that the French Secret Service had been tracking Jean-Marie's biological profile since the end of the Great War. Why would a peaceful businessman be under surveillance by elite intelligence agents? The file suggested that they feared his DNA could be used as a political weapon by extremists. To the state, he wasn't a human being. He was a ticking biological time bomb. Just when Jean-Marie thought he was close to the truth, the laboratory in Germany suddenly stopped communicating. The lead scientist, Friedrich Vogel, released a statement saying that the case was unsolvable. But his private notes told a very different story. Vogel's personal logs mentioned that he found more than enough evidence to confirm the lineage. However, he had been visited by government representatives who advised him that the world was not ready for a living heir to the Third Reich in 1981. It seemed that the truth was being suffocated by international diplomacy. The West was in the middle of the Cold War, and the idea of a French Hitler Jr. was a nightmare that no one wanted to manage. Jean-Marie was fighting a system that preferred a lie. The stress of the scientific battle was breaking Jean-Marie. He was being called a liar by the press and a monster by his neighbors. He began to regret ever opening his mother's old trunk, but the blood in his veins wouldn't let him walk away from the mirror. Then, a former Nazi officer came forward with a story that changed everything again. He claimed that in the final days of the war, he was part of a special unit tasked with locating a chosen son in rural France. He had a map with Jean-Marie's home on it. In 1982, Jean-Marie published his autobiography titled "Your Father's Name Was Hitler." He included every lab result and every measurement. He laid his entire biological identity bare, challenging the world to prove him wrong with science. But as soon as the book hit the shelves, the archival records he cited began to disappear from public libraries. Official birth certificates from 1918 were suddenly misplaced during routine renovations. Someone was scrubbing the trail in real time. Jean-Marie realized that science was no match for the power of the deep state. He was a man without a country and a son without a father. He had one final hope to prove his identity, and it involved a trip to the most secretive archives in the Soviet Union. The journey ended in 1985, but the mystery only grew deeper. Jean-Marie Loret died without ever receiving the official recognition he craved. He left behind a family, a book, and a bloodline that terrified the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. Even in death, he couldn't escape the shadow of the Führer. Just months after he was buried, the Soviet KGB released a fragment of a report. It claimed they had evidence of a secret heir living in France since the end of the 1950s. But the Soviets were playing a game of psychological warfare. They never showed the full file. They kept the world guessing while the Cold War reached its peak. It seemed everyone wanted to use Jean-Marie's blood for their own political survival. Then, the digital age changed everything. In the early 2000s, his children decided to finish what their father started. They turned to the one thing that doesn't lie: DNA. They wanted to compare their genetic code to that of known relatives. But this is where the story takes its darkest turn. When researchers tried to locate the biological remains of the German leader in Russia, they were met with silence. The skull and bones kept in Moscow were suddenly off-limits to any international scientists. Without a direct sample, the case remained in a legal limbo. However, a group of historians in 2012 found a new set of evidence. They discovered a military payroll from 1944 that listed Charlotte Lobjois by name. The payments were massive. They were equivalent to a general's salary. There is no logical reason for the Nazi military to pay a French peasant woman this much money unless she was protecting the most important secret of the entire Third Reich. But then, a DNA test was finally performed using samples from distant relatives in Austria and the United States. The results were published in a major newspaper. For a moment, it seemed the mystery was finally solved once and for all. The test concluded that Jean-Marie Loret was likely not the son of Adolf Hitler. The scientific community exhaled a sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. The bloodline of the world's greatest monster had supposedly ended in that Berlin bunker. But wait until you hear about the flaw in that study. Independent geneticists later pointed out that the samples used were incomplete. The Austrian relatives share very little DNA with the direct paternal line. The proof was built on a house of cards. What happened next was even more suspicious. The lead scientist who dismissed a claim was later found to have ties to a government agency that wanted the story buried. It wasn't about science anymore. It was about preventing a global scandal. If Jean-Marie was the son, his descendants are alive today. They are walking the streets of France, carrying the most cursed genetic code in human history. They live normal lives, but the world continues to watch them from the shadows of the internet. Some believe the CIA and the French Secret Service have the final answer locked in a vault. They are waiting for the last person who remembers the war to die before they release the truth. They are waiting for the history to finally become a myth. The story of Jean-Marie Loret isn't just about a man looking for his father. It's about how easily the truth can be erased by those in power. It's about the secrets we carry in our veins and the lies we are told to keep the world stable. But there is one final document that was recently found in a private collection. It is a letter from 1938, written by a high-ranking Nazi who mentions a successor being raised in secret. The location mentioned was not in Berlin. The letter points to a small village in France, the same village where Charlotte Lobjois lived. If this document is authentic, it means the greatest secret of the 20th century is still out there, hiding in plain sight among the people. And if they lied about his son, what else did they hide in those final days of 1945? The files remain classified, the witnesses are gone, but the blood still flows. And it wasn't the last time a secret heir emerged from history.